Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Professor Dale. I would like to thank Professor Dale and Cynthia, and of course the center, for making my visit possible, and United Airlines as well. But I'm very, very pleased that you made time for my book talk on gender and sexuality in modern Japan. It's the first time that I speak about my book to an audience. As some of you will be aware, when you write a book, you're so happy that it's out and hopefully somebody else will read it. And then it's almost equally happy to return to it and think about what I've actually tried to do here, hopefully accomplishing some of the plans I had in mind originally. What I would like to do today is not so much give a talk about the content of the book, although I will speak about the content of the book, of course, but lead with a number of questions that I've asked myself when conceptualizing the book and then writing the book and finishing the book. And these are the 4 questions I have in mind. Who will read it? Okay. Who will read the book is actually a very awkward question for a scholar, because we usually don't ask that question. We usually assume that the people who read the book are people like we ourselves, other scholars, who will hopefully find something new and original and interesting and something to argue with and hopefully something to struggle with. But that was my initial question. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. The second question was, what do I bring to the book project? And that too is a somewhat unusual question, because we, of course, get trained and then we get interested in things and we get some kind of confidence to actually do something new, even though we might not be trained in that particular subfield or on a particular question. That's one of the exciting things about writing a book. What is in the book? I'll respond to that in a minute as well, in more detail. And the main portion of my talk today will be on the 4th question, namely, how does the book tell its stories? Now, who will read it? The gentleman on your very left is probably going to remain a fantasy of mine as a reader, even though I did ask my teenage daughter to read some of it, and I will not share what she had to say about the chapter or 2 she read. But in any case, who will read it was for me an interesting and exciting question, because I set out to fantasize about a potential readership in ways that I had not done before, hoping, namely, that people who are not specialists of gender and sexuality might read the book. People who are not specialists of modern and contemporary Japan might read it. And of course, students of all kinds of fields might read it. And by students, I think about a broad section of a potential readership, not just students who are studying at a university, but we're all students to some degree, hopefully, until our brain gives out. And so I had this vision of hopefully writing in a way that was interesting to people other than just ourselves. Please do tell me if you happen to read the book in the end, whether I succeeded at least with the people who are in this room now, or who you might know who read the book. What did I bring to the book project? This is only a question because the book was something that Cambridge University Press invited me to write. Normally, at least in my experience, when you are a scholar, you write a book because you want to, because there's a question that interests you, there's a problem that bothers you, there's probably scholarship out there that you think gets it wrong or doesn't ask the right question. But in this case, I was approached because I've done a lot in that field of gender and sexuality studies. And I just wanted to show you these books here and point out that perhaps what I have done in the really vast field of gender and sexuality studies with regards to Japan at this point. And this is really a very rich field with several generations of interesting scholars that have done important work. But perhaps what I've done is pay more attention to modes of manhood and masculinity than most scholars, historians, and anthropologists, and perhaps sociologists have done before. And so it seemed like I would be an obvious candidate to write this book. Now, the chapters of the book are relatively short, I think. And here is the table of contents. There's the first chapter begins with the building the nation and modern manhood. Second chapter, controlling reproduction and motherhood. Redefining womanhoods is chapter 3. And then I go to chapter 4, to sex at war. Chapter 5 gives you the politics of sexual labor. Then I move to queer identities and activisms. And I end with a chapter on sexing visual culture. Some of these chapters, some of these titles will feel much more familiar to you than others, I assume. And I hope there's something in this book for all of you. But instead of going chapter by chapter and telling you what each chapter has as its key questions and content, I want to reorganize the content of the book for our conversation today and really ask about what were the leading questions for me that perhaps were addressed in individual chapters more centrally, but that run through the book in several chapters. And so for those of you who are used to a sort of chronological story that goes from roughly late 19th century to the present moment, please bear with me. That's going to be a tiny bit confusing. But for those of you who are interested in particular questions, in particular problems, hopefully you'll have an easier time to stick with how I present this and think in terms of problem-specific approaches rather than a linear kind of story. That, of course, is also an important thing to tell. Let me begin by acknowledging here that my book builds, of course, on several generations of a long history of scholarly inquiries into what around 1900 was referred to as the sex lives of the Japanese. Now, who is speaking about the sex lives of the Japanese? Obviously, the Japanese were talking about the sex lives of the Japanese, but there were also a whole lot of scholars around the world of various fields who became interested in sexuality, what we call now sexuality at that time was referred to as sex lives, or in German, Geschlechtsleben, if anybody here speaks German. And so these scholars were typically not gender and sexualities experts, of course, that's a field that didn't exist. But it was folklorists, for instance, it was scholars of religious studies, it was scholars of law, it was scholars of biology, medicine, all kinds of fields that struggled with what the significance of sexual activity, to put it very simply, was, and how that might differ in different kinds of cultures. Now, I grew up in Austria and lived the majority of my life in Austria. And so, of course, my approach was not so much from the English language scholarship, but from the German language scholarship. And that's not just because I grew up in a German-speaking country, but it's also because in the late 19th century, and this goes until roughly until the First World War, so roughly until the 1920s, German science, German medicine, German law, and a whole lot of other fields were quite advanced and instrumental and influential in other parts of the world. Now, what did that mean for this dildo set that you see here. And I'm pleased to note that some of you have a smile on their faces, so I've not scared you quite yet. This is of Magnus Hirschfeld, an early German sexologist. And he was one of the many people, along with Ella Wiswell, who you see as a little girl, who went to Japan and became interested in finding out what it actually is that makes Japanese, and this is their perception, so much more open about their sexuality, so much more relaxed about nudity, and all kinds of things. So these were people, along with these two individuals, who came from fairly puritanistic societies, Christian societies. In Hirschfeld's case, he was also a Jewish homosexual scholar. So he came from a culture where, first of all, homosexuality was, of course, illegal, not just perceived to be pathological, but also illegal, was considered, homosexual activity was considered a crime. And so they came to Japan with this, with an open mind and open eyes, and all they saw was a very different way of dealing with sexuality and nudity and the body. Of course, they saw things that Japanese would have told them, and in fact have told them, they misinterpreted and misjudged. But that was sort of the beginning of the European and American interest in Japanese sexuality. I'm building on that. And of course, I'm also building, and much more so, on Japanese scholars' own investigations. Also, again, these were folklorists and early anthropologists who had a lot to say about sexuality. The book, at least this was one of my intentions and goals, was that the book unsettles the long-standing conflation of gender with women. And so, of course, all the young people here will have no problem with that. And of course, gender is not women. But only 20 years ago, when you said gender, most people would think, oh, this is about women, okay? And so one of my projects was very much to bring back into play the fact that not only womanhood and femininity are social constructs or cultural productions, but men and manhood and masculinity as well. And so that's one very, very important point that the book makes. And it's a point that hasn't been made a lot. And when you look at this picture, I hope you will see the smirk on Emperor Hirohito's face. He knows exactly what this means to sit on a cannon, right? It's not coincidental that there is a sexual sort of side to this particular formation of the military leadership and Hirohito. And of course, that's something that we tend to separate, particularly when we talk about Japanese history and the Asia-Pacific War. All of you, I'm sure, know a lot about the former comfort women system and or sexual slavery system or mass rape by Japanese soldiers. But how intrinsic sexuality and sexual violence in particular was in the language of the military, in the training of the military, in even the advertisement of, let's say, condoms, for instance. There were condoms produced at the time that were called Attack Number 1, okay, in reference to a particular combat plane. So these connections are not coincidental. There's very much a very strong interest from military leadership, as well as from commerce and the marketplace, to conflate sexual violence and sexuality with military violence and colonization and imperialism. That's very much on the surface. And that is also not something that is specific to Japan and not to the time. We have very, very clear and explicit comments by American leaders in that led the landing in the Normandy that encouraged American soldiers to join this particular force because they promised that there would be very pretty available French women waiting for them. So this is a conflation that is very, very much on the surface and intrinsic to the military operation from very early on in the late 19th century. So one of my points here is very much to bring manhood and masculinity back into conversations about gender and sexuality. And so that's what the book does. As for all its chapters, it tries to look broadly and generously, I should say, at the period between the late 19th century and today. But I don't go across a chapter chronologically. I zoom in on particular moments when certain concepts are in transition, when they're challenged, when they break down, when they're questioned, when they get reassembled, reconfigured. And of course, manhood and masculinity is something that massively breaks down in 1945 with Japan's defeat. What do I mean by that? We have throughout the modern period a kind of hegemonic vision of what true manhood is that is centered on the soldier, that is centered on the fit male body, okay? So you have a lot of these stories about young men going to the recruitment physical exam and finding that they are fit, and then they're very proud and they go back home and so on. And then there are others with disabilities, soldiers with other kinds of physical issues that prevent them from being classified as able to fight and so on. So that governs what proper most productive manhood means until 1945, when Japan declares defeat and loses the war. And so you see here, of course, one of those soldiers that then returns home, and none of the propaganda that idealized military masculinity for decades meets him. That's gone, because when soldiers return in 1945 and the years after, they come back to a civilian population that no longer wants soldiers to be the leaders of the country, that feel betrayed by their soldiers, both because they dragged them into the war, this is the sort of discourse of the time, and because they lost the war, okay? So major breakdown of what masculinity we're talking about. So 1945 and the decades after mark a major shift to a very different kind of hegemon, and that's the white-collar middle-class man. Most of you are too young to have experienced that sort of idealization of the salaryman in Japan. Of course, they are still around to some degree, but again, since around 1990, with the burst of the bubble, that also came crumbling down, because we no longer have an economy in Japan where large portions of men can seek employment in a large corporation and more or less assume that this would be lifelong employment, okay? For better or worse, there's a diversification of employment for males and females, of course, but this is the 1960s and 1970s are the heyday of a man, white-collar type of masculinity. What does that mean? When you think about your own society, if let's assume you are living here in San Francisco, what's sort of the idealized kind of manhood? I'm sure you will come up with a whole range of different things. I'd love to hear it. I remember when I was a graduate student in Japan in the 90s, I worked as a waitress in a restaurant in the evening. And even the chefs who finished their work around 11 at night and were, of course, in very casual clothes in the kitchen, changed back in proper suits, like dark blue or black suits on the way home. And why they did that was because they wanted to appear to be white-collar office workers that came home late from a long day of work. They didn't want to look like somebody other than a white-collar office worker, okay? So that has changed again, but that's the kind of stuff I wanted to bring to the fore in this book, even though, of course, there's a lot about women and other kinds of sexes and genders as well. Now, allow me to talk a little bit about the cover. I don't know whether this is true for other authors as well. I often discover that my own colleagues don't care much about images, and always makes me so sad, because when I'm done with the book, all I care about is the cover. Is the cover the way I wanted it? Is it placed, and is the font, and is the everything? It's a little bit silly according to some people, but this is where I'm at. This man is a kabuki actor and film actor. His kabuki career has sort of stalled because he had throat cancer, and so he doesn't any longer have the full range of his voice. I discovered him on the Japanese edition of Harper's Bazaar in 2018. And I thought, okay, if I am thinking about my book cover, what should be on the book cover? Those of you who have read about gender and sexuality in Japan, maybe even looked at some of the books, will know there are basically two kinds of covers that such books have. A lot of books have beautiful covers with a modern girl or an advertisement of a female figure from the 1920s on it. That's for obvious reasons, because it does really well as a cover, beautiful covers. And then in more recent years, people have covers that are more easily identifiable as queer, LGBT figures or motifs. What you do not ever have is a man with a baby, a man who identifies as straight with a baby. And I thought, even though I assume all of your fathers have at some point been in this pose, perhaps not in a kimono, that's the most radical thing to be on a cover. And so that's why I chose him. And he very kindly agreed to be on my cover for an undisclosed sum of money. Now, another aspect of the book that I was very, very interested in is to highlight moments of transformation. Okay, so again, not to go the chronological round, but to really zoom in on moments where something happens that affects everything about gender and sexuality. What you see here are anniversary tickets for public transport in the 1920s. How does that affect gender and sexuality? Of course, it affects gender and sexuality massively, because it allows a whole generation of young people to travel and to migrate into urban areas of Japan. Now, you are already in an urban area, but imagine you've grown up in a village somewhere in Japan, and now suddenly you can go to Osaka or Kyoto or Tokyo and be sort of on your own, definitely outside of the control of your parents, your immediate community, your aunt, or whoever else might weigh in on your behavior. Okay, and so absolutely that impacts how men and women and other individuals are able to embody their sex and gender and live their lives. But this is, of course, also a moment when we have new methods of birth control and limiting the number of babies. When you think about the 1920s, just imagine most women in Japan who became pregnant and decided that they couldn't possibly raise another child, or they didn't want to have that baby because it was with somebody they weren't supposed to have a baby with. What did they do? The most common way of limiting, this is the language of the time, I'm not trying to be euphemistic here for your benefit, just this is the moment of the time. The most common way of limiting the number of children was infanticide. Abortion was illegal, although also widely practiced, of course. Okay. And so when we talk about birth control, the birth control movement at the beginning of the 20th century, all urban movements that were in some part communicated back into the most remote villages, precisely via those young men and women who migrated to the city for work or and similar things. The birth control movement at the beginning of the 20th century was all about how to prevent infanticide, so legalize abortion, make abortion both legal and safe. And on top of that, of course, to prevent contraception. And what you see here on the left, those of you who can read Japanese, it's very small, I know, will see this, is one of the early 20th century birth control methods that were invented by a Japanese doctor in the 1930s, namely the menstrual cycle that Ogino Kyusaku found. If you tracked your menstrual cycle well enough, if your life was relatively stable, you could almost tell which of the days of a monthly cycle were relatively safe for having sex without becoming pregnant. Okay, please do not try this as your only method of birth control. This is how my sister came into being. So it often worked. Let's put it that way. Okay. Condoms were available, but expensive. And my favorite thing about condoms, I have a weird set of sensibilities here. My favorite thing about to tell about condoms at the beginning of the 20th century is that they were reused. Okay, they were made of sheep intestines and then washed, hopefully, and reused. So we've come a long way with condoms, I think. But they were available, very expensive, became also prohibited. But the beginning of the 20th century, in terms of major transformations, is also the idea that one should actually not have lots of children who might not survive until adulthood, but have fewer children and raise them better and educate them better and feed them better. This is the moment when formula comes onto the marketplace, even though, of course, Japanese women, the large majority of Japanese women still breastfeed for a long, long, long time after that happens. That said, even though I focus on transformative moments, I've also tried to shed light on the longue durée and the multiple reinventions of gender stereotypes. One of the key things, and many of you know this, is we tend to believe that things always get better, right? Maybe not right now in the US, but generally speaking, maybe our lives are better than our parents' lives in terms of gender expectation, gender role expectations, for instance, in terms of sexual freedoms, in terms of expressing sexuality in various contexts in ways that perhaps our parents, I forget that I'm your parents' age or even older, but older generations have experienced. So we tend to think eventually things get better, and then maybe there's the occasional setback. What we find in the time from the late 19th century to today is that this is often true, and often it's not, okay? So we have often sort of a reinvention of something that we have already dismissed and moved beyond. And that is, of course, true in Japan as well. And I'll just give you one example here. When you look at gender stereotypes with respect to women, the 1920s, my favorite period in that long stretch, is this hopeful moment where we talk about modern girls and new women, and there's discussion about the right to vote and discussion about choosing your partner freely based on love and so on and so forth. Then comes the war. And the war, for all its horrors, particularly in the colonies and in the battlefields, of course, but also in Japan itself, one thing it did was, in fact, because of the absence or relative absence of men, put women in positions they wouldn't have normally been. They worked in munition factories, they worked as policemen, women, they worked in all kinds of professions that they were only getting into because men weren't there. And then we have sort of a reinvention of gender stereotypes here after the war, sort of a reconsideration of these new possibilities and to some degree freedoms of women. And we go back to, or in the 60s and 70s, despite of the blossoming second wave of feminism, we also have a establishing of a particular kind of womanhood, and that woman is a mother, primarily and preferably exclusively. Okay, so here you have from 1968 a campaign poster of the LDP, the Conservative party in Japan, that it's called Liberal Democratic Party, but that shouldn't fool you. Another thing I'm trying to do in the book is to intertwine the stories of prominent and radical figures with experiences of people with ordinary aspirations. And this was really important to me. I'm not going full way and think only about a particular class of women or particularly marginalized women that haven't found their way into the history books yet. I'll try to do both and see, okay, we have here, let's say, somebody like Hiratsuka Daicho, who is a leading figure in a number of different social movements, including suffrage, including birth control, including eugenics. She's in 1917, the first person who proposes a eugenics law. It doesn't go through, but so this is her. Or you have Yamada Waka here, photographed after or before her visit with Eleanor Roosevelt. But then we have ordinary women, like the one caricatured in the center, who in the 1920s suddenly is free to be a chef or to be a nurse or to be a midwife, but clearly struggles, at least according to this caricaturist. And then we have, of course, still a majority of women in Japan far into the 20th century who are primarily farmers and fishers. I should say here that Yamada Waka, and that was one of my smaller joys of writing the book as well. She's not a nice lady, okay? So we're not only talking about, and maybe one of my small criticisms of scholars of gender and sexuality in the Japan field before me is that, of course, we all love to write about people we admire. that we wish we could be like, or that we want to amplify because we share their goals or identify with their persona or their politics. But I've tried here to also highlight women who were also influential, but really quite unpleasant as well. And Yamada Waka is one of them, and I can speak about that a little bit if you are interested later on. Here are some images of women in very new professions. The one on the left and in the middle are, of course, essentially advertisements of women who are now also having professions that weren't open to the center image I'm talking about, that weren't really open. And the interesting thing here in this magazine that is essentially celebrating modernity, the modernity of the 1960s, is that the text often undercuts the kind of progressivism that one might assign to the image, right? Very often speaks about the feminine voices of these police women who accomplish certain things much better. And as I already said, I take each issue, each chapter into the present. These are photographs that you won't find in the book. Some of the images I show are in fact in the book, but these are not in the book. These I took last year, past December or November, I forget. And they feature the goals of a particular political campaign in gender equality and in really conveying that sexual violence and more specifically domestic violence, this DV stands for domestic violence, are not your fault, not the woman's fault. These are political problems. They need to be addressed by politics. And now, for those of you who don't read Japanese or Chinese, I wonder what you'd say about the fact that the only party that promotes gender equality and to deal with sexual violence at home or elsewhere head on is the Communist Party of Japan. These are Communist Party campaign posters. One of the key issues, I think, in Japan is definitely gender equality. Japan is very high up on every index you can. If there are sociologists here, you're familiar with indices of the good life, of education, of social mobility, of social security, healthcare, you name it. Japan is always at the top. There's hardly any crime, and so on and so forth. With respect to gender equality, it's very, very, very far behind about 120 other nation states to this very day. And that's one of the key conundrums, I think, that occupies people like me. Here's the Ikumen passport. And of course, politicians have addressed that, the question of gender equality, in a number of different ways. And I just want to show you a very quick video where a set of governors have made this video to encourage Japanese men to spend more time with their children, to actually take paternity leave. Japan has one of the most generous paternity leave policies, and it has one of the smallest percentages of men who actually take it.
重いこれ。重いですね。もうずしっと肩にきますね。
最初に思ってたよりも重い感じです。
So it says here that in Japan, the Japanese men are spending the least time with their children, with the household.
ありがとうございます。
That's why these governors have dressed up as pregnant women to basically perform what it means to be pregnant in order to encourage Japanese men to help their wives in the house and with children.
子育て支援っていう意味でいろんなことを考えるし思ったことあるんですけれども、この妊婦さんの時にどう過ごせるかということが極めて重要で、子育ての第一歩っていうのはもう妊娠中だというべきになりました。
子供を産む、そして家事をする女性の大変さが実感できました。
I know I'm running out of time very quickly. I just want to say here that this video and other campaigns have had fairly minimal impact. One of the, as you all know, one of the biggest stories of Japan at the moment is the dramatically shrinking birth rate, and ever new governments come up with different kinds of ideas to combat that very slowly. And this is not only a Japan story, of course. Korea actually has even a smaller birth rate. It's just a little behind in terms of the portion of the population that is over a certain age. And China is very close behind as well. And so are a number of other populations. The US is a little bit of an outlier because of migration, right? Migrants tend to be young, tend to come from places where people have children. I've also aimed to diversify the sources of experience and knowledge beyond conventionally respectable texts. And so I discuss here, for instance, this fairly sexist and somewhat racist comic that was produced by one of the occupation soldiers, American occupation soldiers, who also was a caricaturist. There's much more to be said than labeling this as sexist, but you get the idea here. It's sort of both mocking American soldiers, right? These are these dumb blokes from middle America, basically is the tone of the story. And then they run into these Japanese women who are, of course, completely exploiting them in one way or another. So that's the material here. I just have a few more minutes. The book tries throughout to keep the nation and the legacy of the empire in play, not to separate that out in a separate chapter. And so what you have here is the take of two contemporary artists, Shimada Yoko and Madeleine, Boubou de la Madeleine, on the left, as two artists who actually address these issues. And then I discuss the sort of globalization of the comfort women's statue in terms of comfort women's statues being erected in a number of different places around the world for their own local as well as, of course, historical reasons. The book centers intersectionality with regards to sexes, genders, classes, occupations, etc. And here too, my intent was not to just have a whole chapter on LGBTQ plus, but to also populate other chapters that aren't ostensibly about non-normative sexualities with individuals who are identified or identify themselves as such. And so in fact, chapter 1 that is about nation building begins with an individual who is found out at the military physical exam to have markers of both sexes, and how the military surgeon, the military examiners deal with that discovery. Okay, but regardless, there's also a chapter on LGBT, and here you have one individual who also speaks in my book. She goes by the name of Tomato, is a sex worker and an activist for trans individuals. And on the right-hand side, here's again a photograph I took of a toilet sign a couple of months ago. And I find this so fascinating. You will remember the really mind-boggling conversation about bathrooms in the United States. But this is how at least one institution in Japan addressed that. And I find this interesting and somewhat representative of what we're seeing in terms of non-normative sexes and genders in Japan. What this says is daredemo toire, so it's a toilet for everyone, no matter who you are, you use this toilet, you can use this toilet. And then you have the little icons. And one of the things I find so fascinating about this is that they still use this sort of conventional male and female sort of skirt and pants figures, as if nobody had noticed that this sort of incorporates in that image a normative binary understanding of sex and gender. Yeah, maybe I should go to this last point here. The book tries to disrupt the customary bifurcation of the field in gender and women's studies versus LGBT and queer studies. And I focus here not so much on the history of queer sexuality. There is some good work on that, but very little on contemporary and 21st century Japan. And I juxtapose here two individuals that sort of occupy the opposite ends of a continuum of individuals that belong to the queer community and associate themselves with the queer community. On the left, you have Kamikawa Aya, who is the first trans politician in Tokyo, or was the first trans politician in Tokyo, and campaigned on her trans identity. And on the right, you have drag queen Vivian Sato, who has her own interpretations of how she embodies and lives her queer identity. She goes by she. The last chapter then is about the question of obscenity and pornography. Also a favorite question when you look at it historically, because and cross-culturally, of course, because there's so many changes to what people think is obscene or harmful. Okay, one of the key changes in the Japanese discussion over the last 100 years and a little bit is the question of how pornography or obscene material is harmful to children. Okay, 100 years ago, nobody talked about children when they talked about certain kinds of sexuality that were labeled as problematic. They talked about, is there somebody in a compromising position of political value? Is something that is represented on an image, for instance, a political comment on the social order, that could be qualified as pornographic. And of course, there's a whole lot of other things. And I know at least one of your professors here who I'm sure knows a lot about the Edo and modern period. But I'm looking at the current situation, and I picked out an artist who goes by the name Rokude Nashiko. She's not a major artist, okay? Not like Murakami Takashi or Nara Yoshitomo or somebody like that. But she became fairly well known for a particular reason. She made these figurines. I have them at home, they're this size. And then also a kayak based on a 3D model of her vulva. In the Japanese press, it's referred to as the vagina kayak, but of course, this is not the vagina, it's the vulva. I don't know what their problem is. But in any case, that's what she made. And then she had to go to court because she produced these things via crowdsourcing. And because she then circulated her image of her vulva, that was the offense. So there was a whole court case around her. And of course, one of the interesting things about that is that the whole question of obscenity is put into the context and was discussed in the context in Japan of, is this feminism? Is this art? What does it mean to say it's art? Or is it obscenity? And of course, as you can see here, Roko Denashko's answer is, it's laughable that we worry about any of these questions. Thank you so much.